The lie began with a golden hair, severed in the darkness while the goddess Sif slept, and it would end with chains forged from impossible things binding a god beneath the earth until the world's last day. I know this because I was there in the halls of Asgard, when Loki crept into Sif's chamber with shears in hand, when he cut away her magnificent hair, hair like fields of wheat, touched by summer sun hair that was her pride, and her beauty hair that her husband Thor valued almost as much as his hammer Mjolnir. I watched from the shadows unseen as Loki gathered the golden strands and slipped away laughing. And I knew even then that this mischief, like all of Loki's games, would spiral outward in ways no one could predict, touching gods and giants and dwarves, remaking the world through consequences that started with a simple act of malicious whimsy. The trickster never understood, or perhaps understood too well, that every promise he made carried a price, and that price would always come due no matter how clever he thought himself, no matter how many shapes he wore or lies he told. This is the story of those promises and those prices, and the mischief that bound the fate of gods. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Loki, son of the giant Loki, blood brother to Odin All-Father, was never meant to fit in Asgard. He was beautiful where the other gods were strong, clever where they were brave, quick where they were steadfast. His tongue was silver, his mind labyrinthine, and his nature contradictory in ways that made the straightforward gods of Asgard deeply uncomfortable. He was counted among the Aesir, lived in their halls, fought beside them, counseled them, and yet he was always other, always apart, always the one who saw angles and possibilities where others saw only straight lines. The cutting of Sif's hair was not Loki's first act of mischief, nor even his 100th. He had a history of such things, small cruelties and elaborate pranks, lies told for their own sake, chaos created simply to see what would happen. He had once tied a goat to his own beard and engaged in a tug-of-war that left a goddess laughing so hard she granted him a boon. He had stolen Freya's falcon cloak on multiple occasions just to fly about Asgard spreading rumors. He had convinced the blind god Hodor to throw mistletoe at Balder, though that story comes later and is darker than the others. But the hair, that was different. That touched Thor's pride. And Thor's pride was a dangerous thing to wound. When Sif woke and found her golden hair gone, replaced by stubble, her scream shook the rafters of her hall. Thor came running, Mjolnir in hand, expecting enemies, finding only his wife weeping before her mirror, her beauty shorn away, her glory reduced to humiliation. The thunder god's rage was immediate and absolute. He knew, without needing to be told, who had done this. There was only one in Asgard, with the malice and the nerve to violate his home, to harm his wife, to mock him so directly. Thor found Loki in the great hall, drinking mead and trading jokes with some of the younger gods, and he seized him by the throat and lifted him off his feet with one hand. The hall fell silent. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that could end in Loki's death, and no one was entirely sure whether that would be justice or tragedy. "My wife's hair," Thor growled, his voice like distant thunder promising storms. "Where is it?" Loki, even dangling from Thor's grip, managed to smile. "I thought she might look fetching with shorter hair. A new style. Very fashionable among the—" Thor's grip tightened, cutting off Loki's words. "You have until sunset to restore it, or I will break every bone in your body, starting with the smallest and working my way up to your skull." "That seems excessive," Loki wheezed. "Perhaps we could negotiate." "Sunset," Thor repeated and dropped Loki to the floor. Loki lay there for a moment, rubbing his throat, his mind already racing through possibilities. He couldn't restore the hair he'd taken. That was gone, burned, scattered. But he could replace it. He could get new hair, better hair, hair that would make Sif more beautiful than before. And if he was going to the trouble of commissioning magical hair, He might as well get some other treasures while he was at it. Things that would turn this disaster into an opportunity that would transform Thor's rage into gratitude. This was Loki's gift and his curse, the ability to see solutions where others saw only problems, to turn every crisis into a game, every threat into a challenge to his cleverness. He never simply accepted consequences. He always believed he could talk his way out, scheme his way around, find some angle that would let him emerge not just unscathed, but victorious. He left Asgard that afternoon, crossing the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost to Midgard, and from there descending into Svartalfheim, the realm of the dwarves. The dwarves were master craftsmen, capable of creating wonders that even the gods coveted. Their forges ran deep beneath mountains, their hammers rang in darkness, and their prices were always interesting. Loki found his way to the workshop of Ivaldi's sons, dwarves renowned for their skill. They were suspicious of him. Everyone who knew Loki was suspicious of him, but he had a way of making even suspicion seem like an opportunity. "I need you to create 3 things," Loki said, settling onto a stone bench in their workshop, ignoring the heat from the forges and the suspicious glares from the brothers. "First, hair for the goddess Sif, golden hair that will grow like natural hair once placed upon her head. Second, a ship called Skidbladnir, large enough to hold all the gods but able to be folded small enough to fit in a pocket, and which will always find favorable winds. Third, a spear called Gungnir, which will never miss its mark once thrown." The eldest of Ivaldi's sons, a dwarf named Dvalin, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "These are not small requests. The hair alone would require magic beyond mere craftsmanship. The ship and spear. These are treasures fit for the All-Father himself, which is why I'm commissioning them," Loki said smoothly. "Imagine the fame that would come to your workshop. The sons of Ivaldi, who created treasures for Odin. It would make your fortune." "And what would you pay us?" another brother asked. Loki smiled. "Your fame, your reputation, the knowledge that the gods themselves use items from your forge. Isn't that worth more than gold?" The dwarves exchanged glances. They were being manipulated, and they knew it, but they were also craftsmen, and the challenge of creating such items was appealing. Pride, in the end, made them agree. They would create the 3 treasures, and Loki would owe them a favor, undefined, to be called in when they chose. Loki agreed readily. Future debts meant nothing to him. He only cared about solving the immediate problem, and he was already thinking ahead to how he could use these treasures to not only appease Thor, but gain favor with Odin, and perhaps improve his own standing in Asgard. The dwarves worked for 3 days, their hammers ringing, their forges blazing. Magic was woven into metal and gold, runes carved with precision that would make the items more than mere objects. When they finished, Loki held 3 treasures that would become legendary. Hair of spun gold that lived and grew a ship that defied the laws of space and physics, and a spear that embodied certainty itself. Once thrown, it would strike its target, reality bending to ensure it. But Loki, being Loki, couldn't leave it at that. As he prepared to depart Svartalfheim, he encountered another dwarf, Brock, brother to the smith Sindri. Brock was examining the treasures with obvious envy, and Loki, unable to resist needling him, made a comment about how these were surely the finest treasures ever created by dwarves, how no one could possibly craft better. Brock bristled. "My brother Sindri could forge better treasures than these in his sleep." "I doubt it," Loki said, baiting the hook. "I would wager anything on it," Brock declared. Loki's eyes gleamed. "Anything? Would you wager your head?" "I would wager my head that Sindri can create 3 treasures superior to these." "Then I'll wager mine that he cannot," Loki said, extending his hand. "My head against yours. Your brother creates 3 items. The gods will judge which set is superior. If yours win, you get my head. If mine win, I get yours." They shook on it, and Loki walked away smiling, certain he'd just guaranteed his safety. Even if Sindri created comparable treasures, the gods would never declare them superior to items Loki was bringing specifically to save his own life. The bet was a certainty. which made it not really a bet at all, just another game he was guaranteed to win. He should have known better. He should have remembered that certainty is the feeling you have right before reality teaches you how wrong you are. Brok returned to his brother Sindri and told him of the wager. Sindri, a dwarf of few words but immense pride, simply nodded and went to his forge. He would create 3 items, and they would be wonders that surpassed anything the sons of Ivaldi had made. But he warned his brother, "I will work the forge and the bellows. You must pump the bellows continuously, without stopping, no matter what happens. If you stop even for a moment, the items will be ruined." Brok agreed, and Sindri began his work. For the first item, Sindri laid a pig's skin in the forge and instructed Brok to pump the bellows. Brok pumped steadily, sweat pouring down his face from the heat, and then a fly appeared, a large black fly that buzzed around Brok's head annoyingly. The fly landed on Brok's hand and bit him hard enough to draw blood. Brok grimaced but kept pumping. The fly was, of course, Loki, who could take many shapes, and who was now desperately trying to sabotage the work. When Sindri removed the work from the forge, it was a golden boar, living and breathing, with bristles that glowed like light. He named it Gullinbursti, golden bristles, and it could run through air and water faster than any horse, and its bristles shone so brightly they could illuminate the darkest night. For the second item, Sindri placed gold in the forge. Again, Brok pumped the bellows, and again the fly appeared. This time it landed on Brok's neck and bit twice as hard as before. Brok flinched, his rhythm faltering for just an instant, but he kept pumping. The fly buzzed away, frustrated. Sindri removed from the forge a golden ring, which he named Draupnir. Every 9th night the ring would drip 8 new rings of equal weight and purity, generating endless wealth. For the third item, Sindri placed iron in the forge and gave Brok the same instruction. Pump without stopping, no matter what. This item was the most important, requiring perfect consistency. Brok pumped and the fly returned, more vicious than before. It landed on Brok's eyelid and bit down hard, and blood ran into Brok's eye, blinding him. The pain was excruciating, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second, Brok stopped pumping to swat the fly away. It was enough. When Sindri removed the item from the forge, it was a hammer, magnificent and powerful, but with one flaw. Its handle was slightly too short, making it somewhat unwieldy. Sindri frowned but said nothing. The hammer, which he named Mjolnir, would return to its wielder's hand when thrown, would strike with the force of mountains, would never break, and could only be lifted by one worthy to wield it. Despite its shortened handle, it was still a weapon of devastating power. The 3 treasures were complete. Brok gathered them and traveled to Asgard. Arriving shortly after, Loki had already presented his own 3 treasures to the gods. The gods had assembled in the great hall, and Loki had made quite a show of presenting the golden hair to Thor and Sif. When Sif placed the hair upon her head, it rooted itself and grew, becoming even more magnificent than her original hair had been. Thor's anger melted into gratitude, and Loki smiled, thinking himself safe. Then he presented Skidbladnir to Freya, god of fertility and prosperity, explaining how the ship could hold all the gods but fold into a pocket. Freya was delighted. Finally Loki presented Gungnir to Odin, and the All-Father hefted the spear, feeling its balance, understanding immediately the magic woven into it. This was a weapon worthy of the king of the gods. Loki was basking in his triumph when Brok entered the hall. "I too have 3 treasures," Brok announced, "created by my brother Sindri, and superior to those the Trickster has presented." Loki's smile didn't falter, but something cold moved through his chest. He'd forgotten about the wager in his relief at solving the initial problem. Now the price was coming due. Brok presented Gullinbursti to Freyr, and the god marveled at the living boar that could run faster than any horse and light the darkest night. He presented Draupnir to Odin, explaining how it would generate endless wealth, and the All-Father slipped it onto his finger, feeling the magic within it. And finally Brok presented Mjolnir to Thor, explaining its powers despite its shortened handle. Thor lifted the hammer, and something passed between god and weapon, a recognition, a bond. Despite the imperfect handle, Mjolnir felt right in his hand in a way nothing else ever had. This was his weapon, forged for him even though the maker hadn't known him. This was power made manifest, simplicity and strength given form. The gods deliberated. Both sets of treasures were magnificent, but which were superior? Freyr had a ship and a boar, both wonderful, but he chose the boar. Odin had a spear and a ring, both priceless, but the ring's endless wealth tipped the balance. And Thor had gratitude for the hair that restored his wife's beauty, but in his hand he held Mjolnir. And there was no contest. The hammer was his, would always be his, was perhaps always meant to be his. The judgment was rendered. Sindri's treasures, by narrow margin, were superior. The wager was decided. Brock had won. Loki's head was forfeit. Loki's smile finally disappeared. He looked around the hall, seeing the faces of the gods, reading their expressions. Some were amused, some were satisfied. None were planning to intervene. He had made the wager freely. He would pay the price. "Well," Loki said, his voice carefully casual, "a wager is a wager. My head is yours, Brock, but, and this is important, the wager was for my head only, not my neck. If you can take my head without touching my neck, it's yours." Brock stared at him. "That's impossible. You cannot separate head from body without cutting through the neck." "Then it seems you have a problem," Loki said, already moving toward the door. "I fulfilled the terms by allowing you to compete. You won the right to my head, but the conditions of that right are clear. Head only, not neck. Since you cannot claim it, I'll be—" He didn't finish the sentence because Thor had moved to block the door, Mjolnir hanging loosely in his grip. "You'll stay," Thor said simply. Loki looked around again, seeing escape routes closing, seeing the trap he'd built for himself. His cleverness, his way with words, his ability to find loopholes, none of it would save him now. The gods were tired of his tricks, tired of his schemes, tired of the way he always slipped out of consequences. But Brock, staring at Loki's smirking face, came to a decision. "Fine, I cannot take your head without touching your neck, but nothing in our wager prevents me from sealing your lying mouth." He pulled out an awl and thread, tools of his craft, and before Loki could react, before he could shift shape or teleport away or employ any of his tricks, Brock stitched Loki's lips together with strong dwarven thread, pulling tight, turning Loki's greatest weapon, his silver tongue, against him. The pain was excruciating. Loki screamed, but the sound was muffled by his sealed mouth. He clawed at his face, trying to tear the threads free, but dwarven craft was strong, and every movement sent new waves of agony through him. The gods watched, and though some looked uncomfortable, none intervened. This was justice, they told themselves. This was what Loki had earned. It took Loki 3 days to work the threads free. 3 days of pain and humiliation and rage. And when he finally tore his mouth open again, blood running down his chin, his face scarred from the awl and the tearing, something had changed in him. The mischief was still there, the cleverness, the quicksilver mind. But now, there was something darker underneath, something wounded and furious, something that remembered being held down while the gods watched and did nothing. This moment, this humiliation, would echo forward through time, would color every interaction Loki had with the gods from this point on, would inform decisions he would make that would ultimately lead to Ragnarok itself, to the end of all things. But that comes later. For now, Loki retreated to lick his wounds and plot his revenges, small and large. The gods had their treasures. Thor had his hammer, which would become the most famous weapon in the 9 realms. Odin had his ring and his spear. Freya had his boar and his ship. And Loki had his scars and his fury and his unbreakable conviction that the gods would pay for what they had done to him. But before we follow that thread to its dark conclusion, we must understand who Loki was, and why the gods kept him close, despite knowing he was dangerous, despite knowing he would ultimately betray them. Loki was, as I said, son of giants, but he was counted among the Aesir through blood brotherhood, with Odin. The All-Father had, in ancient times, mingled his blood with Loki's, creating a bond that meant Loki could not be cast out without Odin himself being diminished. This bond was strategic. Odin recognized Loki's usefulness, even as he understood Loki's danger. The trickster could go places and do things that the straightforward gods could not. He could lie convincingly. He could shift shapes. He could navigate situations where honor and strength were useless, where only cunning and creativity could succeed. Time and again, Loki had proven valuable to the gods. When they needed to escape a contract with a giant who was building their walls, Loki was the one who found the solution, even if that solution required him to seduce the giant's horse while in the form of a mare, an act that resulted in him giving birth to Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, a story that Loki preferred not to discuss. When Idun and her youth-giving apples were stolen, endangering all the gods with age and death, Loki retrieved them. When the gods needed information from places they couldn't reach, or people who wouldn't talk to them, Loki was the one they sent. He was useful. That was his protection and his curse. The gods needed him even as they hated needing him, even as they distrusted him, even as they knew he would eventually turn on them. They kept him close because the alternative, having him as an enemy outside Asgard, was more terrifying than having him as an uncertain ally within it. And Loki, for his part, had complicated feelings about the gods. He despised them, their self-righteousness, their certainty, their privilege of always being right because they had the strength to make right irrelevant. But he also craved their acceptance, wanted to truly belong in Asgard rather than being merely tolerated, wished he could be valued for more than his utility. This contradiction drove many of his actions. The desire to prove himself superior to the gods while simultaneously wanting them to acknowledge him as one of them. The incident with Sif's hair in one reading was an attempt to humiliate Thor, to show that the great thunder god could be violated in his own home, that his strength couldn't protect him from cleverness. But in another reading, it was Loki's way of creating a crisis he could then solve, forcing the gods to admit they needed him, demonstrating his value through his ability to fix problems he himself created. This pattern repeated throughout Loki's time among the gods. He would create chaos, then position himself as the solution, then feel aggrieved when the gods didn't thank him sufficiently for solving problems he had caused. It was pathological, self-defeating, and utterly consistent with his character. After the incident with his lips being sewn shut, Loki's mischief took on a harder edge. His pranks became crueler, his lies more dangerous, his schemes more likely to put gods at risk. He was testing boundaries, pushing to see how far he could go before the gods would finally cast him out entirely, give him the exile he half wanted, prove that he had been right all along about never truly belonging. One of his darker schemes involved the goddess Idun and her apples of youth. The gods remained young and vigorous by eating these apples regularly, and without them, they would age like mortals. Loki, coerced by a giant named Thjazi, lured Idun outside Asgard's walls, where the giant, in eagle form, abducted her and carried her to Jotunheim, the realm of giants. Without Idun's apples, the gods began to age. Their strength waned, their beauty faded, their vitality drained away. Panic set in. Odin summoned Loki and demanded to know what had happened to Idun. And Loki, seeing the aged faces of the gods, feeling his own joints beginning to stiffen, confessed his role. The gods were ready to kill him then, but Odin stayed their hands. First, he fixes this, then we decide his fate. So Loki borrowed Freya's falcon cloak and flew to Jotunheim, to Thjazi's hall, and found Idun imprisoned there. He transformed her into a nut, carried her back to Asgard in his talons, and was pursued by Thjazi in eagle form. The gods, warned of Loki's return, built a great fire on Asgard's walls, and when Loki flew through, they lit it. Thjazi, following too closely, had his wings burned and fell into Asgard where Thor killed him with Mjolnir. Idun was restored. The gods ate her apples and regained their youth, and Loki was once again both hero and villain, both problem and solution, neither thanked nor punished, but simply tolerated as the necessary evil he had become. But Thiazi had a daughter, Skadi, and she came to Asgard seeking vengeance for her father's death. She came armed and dangerous, a giantess who could match any god in battle, and she demanded compensation, either blood or treasure, either Thor's life for her father's, or some other payment sufficient to balance the scales. The gods negotiated, offering her a husband from among the Aesir and whatever other compensation she deemed appropriate. She agreed, but with conditions. She would choose her husband based only on seeing the god's feet, nothing else. She hoped to choose Balder, most beautiful of the gods, but looking at feet alone, she chose Njord, whose feet were beautiful from years of seawater. The marriage was not happy. She was a mountain giantess, he was a sea god, and neither could stand living in the other's realm. But it satisfied the letter of the agreement. Skadi also demanded that the gods make her laugh, something she swore was impossible given her grief. The gods tried and failed, until Loki came forward. He tied one end of a rope to a goat, and the other end to his own testicles, and proceeded to engage in a tug-of-war that had both him and the goat shrieking in pain while performing a grotesque, obscene dance around the hall. Skadi, despite herself, laughed until tears ran down her face, and the debt was satisfied. Loki paid for this act with agony and humiliation, but he did it to save the gods, to prevent war with Skadi, to be, once again, useful in ways no one else could be. And once again, the gods' gratitude was grudging, their acknowledgement minimal, their treatment of him unchanged. These patterns of behavior, these cycles of mischief and rescue, harm and healing, continued for years uncounted. Loki remained in Asgard, married to the goddess Sigyn, who loved him with a devotion he probably didn't deserve. They had children together, Narfi and Vali, and Loki also had 3 monstrous children with the giantess Angerboda, Fenrir the wolf, Jormungandr the world serpent, and Hel, who ruled the realm of the dead. The gods feared these children, seeing in them threats to the cosmic order. They cast Jormungandr into the ocean, where it grew so large it encircled the world, biting its own tail. They gave Hel dominion over the realm of the dead, where she ruled those who died of sickness and age, rather than in battle. And Fenrir they tried to bind. The wolf grew larger and stronger each day, and prophecy suggested he would be instrumental in the destruction of the gods at Ragnarok. The gods attempted to chain him, but Fenrir broke every chain they forged. Finally, they had the dwarves create Gleipnir, a chain made from impossible things, the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Gleipnir appeared delicate like a silk ribbon, but it was unbreakable. The gods challenged Fenrir to allow himself to be bound with it, to prove his strength by breaking it. Fenrir, suspicious of trickery, agreed only if one of the gods would place their hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith. If the binding proved to be a trap rather than a test, he would bite off the hand. The gods looked at each other, none willing to sacrifice their hand, until Tyr, god of war and justice, stepped forward and placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth. The gods bound the wolf with Gleipnir, and when Fenrir discovered he could not break free, when he realized he'd been deceived, he bit down. Tyr lost his hand at the wrist, and Fenrir was bound to a rock deep beneath the earth, where he would remain until Ragnarok. Loki watched all of this, watched his son betrayed and bound, watched the gods celebrate their successful deception, and said nothing. But something calcified in him then, some final wall going up between him and the gods, some determination forming that would eventually crystallize into the decision that would bring everything down. But that moment hadn't come yet. For now, Loki continued his role as trickster and problem solver, sometimes helping the gods, sometimes hindering them, always keeping them off balance, always ensuring they could never quite trust him, but could never quite banish him either. One of his most famous exploits involved Thor's stolen hammer. The giant Thrym stole Mjolnir while Thor slept, hiding it 8 leagues beneath the earth. and declared he would only return it if Freya agreed to marry him. Freya, goddess of love and beauty, refused absolutely. No treasure, no matter how valuable, was worth marrying a giant she despised. The gods were in crisis. Thor without his hammer was like the sun without light. Diminished, vulnerable, wrong. They needed the hammer back, but no one could retrieve it by force from where Thrym had hidden it, and no one could convince Freya to martyr herself by marrying the giant. It was Loki, of course, who came up with the solution. Thor would dress as a bride, wearing Freya's clothing and veil, and Loki would accompany him disguised as a bridesmaid. They would go to Thrym's hall, and at the wedding feast, when Mjolnir was brought out to sanctify the marriage, as was traditional, Thor would seize it and take his revenge. The plan was absurd. Thor, with his red beard and massive frame and aggressive demeanor, would make an unconvincing bride. But Loki was persuasive, and Thor was desperate, so he agreed. They dressed him in bridal finery, veiled his face, and traveled to Jotunheim. At the feast, Thrym was delighted with his bride, though he found some of her behavior strange. She ate an entire ox, 8 salmon, and all the dainties meant for the women, and drank 3 casks of mead. When Thrym expressed surprise at this appetite, Loki, as bridesmaid, explained that Freya had been so excited about the wedding she hadn't eaten in 8 days. When Thrym tried to kiss his bride and lifted her veil, he was startled by the fierce, blazing eyes that glared at him. Again Loki smoothly explained that Freya had been so eager for the wedding she hadn't slept in 8 days, hence her wild eyes. Finally the moment came to sanctify the marriage. Mjolnir was brought forth and laid in the bride's lap, as was traditional. Thor's hands closed around the handle, and his disguise was done. He stood throwing off the veil and dress, and began smashing giants with his reclaimed hammer, Loki laughing beside him as they carved their way out of the hall and back to Asgard. This story became one of the most told in Asgard. Thor dressed as a bride, Loki as his bridesmaid. The thunder god's humiliation transformed into triumph. Loki had once again proven his value, his creativity, his ability to solve impossible problems through wit and cunning. And yet, characteristically, his reward was mockery. Jokes about his bridesmaid performance, teasing about his willingness to wear women's clothing.
Every slight, every mockery, every casual dismissal added weight to the resentment Loki carried. He remembered each one, catalogued them, nursed his grievances like wounds that wouldn't heal. And slowly, imperceptibly, the balance was tipping, the scales approaching the moment when Loki would decide that his service to the gods had been repaid, that whatever debt he owed Odin was cleared, that the time had come to stop solving problems for gods who would never appreciate him and start creating problems they could unsolve. The turning point, the moment when Loki's mischief transformed from annoying to apocalyptic, came at a feast in Aegir's hall. Aegir was a Jotun associated with the sea, neither fully god nor fully giant, and he hosted a feast for all the gods. It was meant to be a celebration, a time of peace and plenty, a gathering where ancient grudges could be set aside and all could enjoy food and drink and fellowship. Loki arrived at the feast in a foul mood. He'd been excluded from the initial planning, only invited at the last moment, and he felt the slight keenly. He sat at the margins, drinking heavily, watching the gods laugh and boast and congratulate each other on their various victories and virtues. And something in him snapped. He stood and began to speak, and what came out was venom, pure and undiluted. He went around the hall, god by god, and revealed their secrets, mocked their pretensions, exposed their hypocrisies. He reminded Odin of times he'd fled from battle, questioned his wisdom, suggested his sacrifices for knowledge were less noble than pathetic. He accused Frigg, Odin's wife, of infidelity. He mocked Freya's promiscuity, Tyr's lost hand, Heimdall's role as watchman, suggesting it meant he was considered too stupid for anything more important. And Thor, when Thor threatened him with Mjolnir, Loki reminded him of times he'd hidden in fear, of times his strength had failed him, of the indignity of dressing as a bride even if the plan had succeeded. God after god, Loki tore into them, and what made it devastating was that he told truths, not lies. He revealed things that had happened, exposed flaws that existed, held up a mirror that showed the gods not as they wished to be seen, but as they actually were: petty, flawed, hypocritical, cruel. The feast dissolved into chaos. Gods shouted at Loki, at each other, old grievances bubbling up, the veneer of fellowship cracking to reveal the resentments beneath. And Loki laughed at it all, drunk on his own venom, finally speaking truths he'd been carrying for centuries, finally showing the gods what he really thought of them. It couldn't stand. Thor eventually chased Loki from the hall, and the gods understood that something fundamental had broken, that Loki had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had been troublesome before, irritating, occasionally dangerous. But now he was intolerable. Something would have to be done. The final straw, the act that sealed Loki's fate, involved Balder, most beloved of all the gods. Balder was perfect in ways that even the gods found remarkable, beautiful, wise, kind, incapable of malice or deception. Everyone loved Balder, and his presence in Asgard was like sunlight, making everything brighter and better just by existing. He was what the gods aspired to be, proof that divinity could be genuinely good rather than merely powerful. Balder began having dreams of his own death, nightmares that terrified him and concerned all the gods. His mother, Frigg, determined to protect him, traveled throughout the 9 realms extracting oaths from everything, every animal, plant, stone, metal, disease, that they would not harm Balder. And having received these oaths, Balder became invulnerable. The gods made a game of it, throwing weapons at him, watching them bounce off harmlessly, celebrating his invincibility. But Frigg, in her thoroughness, had overlooked one thing: mistletoe. It seemed too young, too harmless to bother asking for its oath. And Loki, watching the gods play their game with Balder, realized this oversight represented an opportunity. Why did he do it? Even now, the motive remains debated. Was it jealousy of Balder's perfection, of the love all gods showed him without reservation? Was it a desire to prove that nothing is truly invulnerable, that every system has a weakness? Was it simply the culmination of years of resentment, a decision to hurt the gods in the most devastating way possible? Or was it something darker, a recognition that fate required Balder's death, that Ragnarok could not come without it, that Loki was simply fulfilling his role in a story already written? Whatever the motive, the action was simple. Loki fashioned a dart from mistletoe and gave it to Hodr, Balder's blind brother, suggesting he should participate in the game, that Loki would guide his hand so he could throw something at Balder like everyone else. Hodr, wanting to honor his brother, agreed. The dart flew, struck Balder in the chest, and the perfect god fell dead. The silence that followed was absolute. Balder lay dead, killed by the one thing that could harm him, and the gods understood immediately that this was not accident but murder, that Loki had orchestrated it, that their beloved Balder was gone and would not return. Frigg made a desperate plea. Would anyone ride to Hela's realm and bargain for Balder's return? Hermod, another of Odin's sons, volunteered. He rode Sleipnir, Loki's offspring, to the realm of the dead and begged Hel to release Balder. She agreed, but with a condition. If everything in the 9 realms wept for Balder, proving his universal love, she would release him. But if even one thing refused to weep, he would remain with her. Messengers were sent throughout all the realms, and everything wept for Balder. Gods and humans, animals and plants, even stones wept, as they do when temperature changes and water condenses on them. Everything wept except one thing, a giantess named Thok, who refused, saying Balder had never done anything for her, so why should she grieve his loss? Thok was Loki in disguise. He ensured his own crime could not be undone, guaranteed that Balder would remain dead, that the gods would suffer this loss permanently. It was cruelty beyond mischief, malice beyond pranks. It was unforgivable. The gods hunted Loki. He fled, transformed into a salmon, and hid in a waterfall, but the gods found him. They dragged him to a cave deep beneath the earth, and there they enacted their revenge. They took Loki's sons, Narfi and Vali, and they transformed Vali into a wolf. In his wolf form, Vali attacked and killed his own brother Narfi, ripping him apart while Loki watched, screaming. They took Narfi's entrails and used them as ropes, binding Loki to 3 stone slabs, one under his shoulders, one under his loins, one under his knees. And then, because this wasn't enough, because they wanted Loki to suffer eternally, they placed a serpent above him that dripped burning venom onto his face. Seijen, Loki's wife, stayed with him. She held a bowl to catch the venom, protecting him from its burn. But when the bowl filled and she had to turn away to empty it, the venom fell on Loki's face, and his thrashing in agony was so violent it caused earthquakes in Midgard above.
This was where Loki would remain until Ragnarok, until the end of everything, bound and tormented, his punishment eternal. And when Ragnarok finally came, when the chains would break and Loki would be free, he would lead the giants in the final battle against the gods, would kill and be killed, would ensure that the world that had bound him would end in fire and ice. The promise Loki had made, the price of his mischief, was paid not just by him, but by everyone. The gods paid with Baldur's death, with their own coming destruction at Ragnarok, with the end of their age and their world. Loki paid with an eternity of torture, with the deaths of his children, with the knowledge that he had destroyed everything including himself, and the 9 realms paid with their own ending, with the twilight of the gods and the breaking of the world. Was Loki villain or victim? Was he monster or scapegoat? The myths don't provide clear answers, and perhaps that's appropriate. Loki was many things: trickster and murderer, helper and destroyer, god and giant, male and female, father and mother. He was contradiction personified, possibility taken to its logical extreme, chaos given divine form. What we can say is this: Loki's promises always carried prices that were higher than anticipated, and his mischief always had consequences that spiraled beyond control. He believed he was clever enough to manipulate outcomes, to gain benefits without costs, to play games where the rules didn't apply to him. But in the end, the rules applied. They always apply. And the price of his mischief was the end of a world. In some versions of the myths there is a coda to Loki's story. After Ragnarok, after the world burns and drowns and the gods and giants kill each other, a new world emerges from the waters, green and beautiful. A few gods survive. Baldur returns from hell, reborn into this new world. And Loki? What becomes of Loki is unclear. Some say he dies fighting Heimdall, each killing the other. Some say he simply ceases to exist, his role completed, his purpose fulfilled. Some say he, too, is reborn, that the new world needs a trickster as much as the old one did, that chaos and order must always dance together. The truth, if there is truth in myths that were never meant to be taken literally, is that Loki represents something fundamental about existence. The fact that systems break down, that order generates chaos, that the same forces that build can destroy. That promise and price are 2 sides of the same coin. Every time we act in the world, we make promises, implicit or explicit, about what we'll do and who we'll be. And every promise carries a price, not always the one we expect, not always the one we choose to pay, but always there, waiting to come due. Loki's tragedy was believing he could avoid this, could be exempt from consequences, could manipulate reality without reality pushing back. The gods' tragedy was believing they could bind chaos, control it, keep it useful without letting it be dangerous. They wanted Loki's gifts without his flaws, his solutions without his problems, his creativity without his destruction. But you cannot have one without the other. The trickster who saves you today will betray you tomorrow, not because he's changed, but because he hasn't. He's always been both, and you chose to see only the parts you found useful. This is the lesson of the trickster's promise. There is no mischief without price, no chaos without consequence, no breaking of rules without cost. Loki knew this, perhaps better than the gods did, but he believed he was clever enough that the price would always be paid by someone else. He was wrong. The price was paid by everyone, himself included, and it was higher than anyone could have imagined. And so the trickster remains in our stories, in our myths, in our understanding of how the world works. He is the chaos at the edge of order, the lie wrapped in truth, the betrayal lurking in alliance, the price hidden in every promise. He is Loki, son of giants, blood brother to gods, father of monsters, bound beneath the earth until the world's last day, when his chains will break and the price will finally be paid in full, and everything will burn, and from the ashes perhaps something new will grow, the golden hair that started it all, severed while a goddess slept, led thread by thread, consequence by consequence, to chains and venom and the twilight of the gods. That is the nature of mischief, and that is the price of promises, and that is the story of Loki, who was too clever for his own good, and not wise enough to see that cleverness without wisdom is just another word for doom.